As much as the concept of banned books is a very hot button topic, some pieces of literature should be relegated to museum exhibits instead of maybe being freely accessible. Today we're talking about specific biographies and things I shouldn't even be discussing on the internet, and more, so let's get into it before I get dinged. The Book of Enoch is an ancient Hebrew apocalyptic religious text, ascribed by tradition to the patriarch Enoch, who was the father of Methuselah and the great-grandfather of Noah. So this contains unique material on the origins of demons and more, along with why some angels fell from heaven, an explanation of why the Genesis flood was morally necessary, and an exposition of the 1,000-year reign of the Messiah. So there's at least 3 books that are traditionally attributed to this prophet, including the distinct works 2 and 3. None of those are considered to be canonical scripture by most Jewish or Christian church bodies, ergo why a lot of folks want this kind of banned and out of the way. The older sections of it are estimated to date from about 300 to 200 BC. The latest part is about like 100 BC. A lot of scholars believe this was originally written in probably Hebrew, since these were the languages first used for Jewish texts. Now, some folks suggest that this, kind of like the Book of Daniel, was composed partially in Hebrew, but fun fact, no Hebrew version has survived. The individuals residing in the Qumran caves, where the Dead Sea Scrolls and the book were unearthed, were not aligned with the mainstream Jewish sect known as the Pharisees. Instead, they were affiliated with a splinter group who adhered to distinctive practices. So, ergo, this book, alongside numerous other texts discovered in the caves, is recognized for its substantial variance from things that we know. So authors of the New Testament were also familiar with some content of the stories. Like a short section of 1 Enoch is cited in the New Testament of Jude, and attributed there to Enoch the 7th from Adam. But this is kind of a variance on a lot of other things that are more mainstream. Copies of the earlier sections of Enoch 1 were preserved among the Dead Sea Scrolls, like I mentioned already. So this book only survives in its entirety in Ethiopic translation. Yes, it is part of the biblical canon used by the Ethiopian Jewish community, as well as the Christian Ethiopian Orthodox Church, but a lot of other groups regard it as non-canonical or non-inspired. They do accept it as having historical or theological interest, but they kind of don't want to accept it as canon, ergo they kind of want it out of the way. The Acts and Monuments, popularly known as Fox's Book of Martyrs, is a work of Protestant history and martyrology by Protestant English historian John Fox, first published in 1563 by John Day. It includes an account of the sufferings of Protestants under the Catholic Church, with particular emphasis on England and Scotland. Now, this book was highly influential in those countries and helped shape lasting popular notions of Catholicism there. The book went through 4 editions in Fox's lifetime, and a number of later editions and abridgments, including some that specifically reduced the text to a Book of Martyrs. After the Reformation, Catholic apologists raised the issue of the novelties of Protestant doctrines, as exploiting religious credulity for material and intercourse-related ends. So Protestant apologists, such as Calvinist Anglican John Fox, sought to establish the continuity of a pro-Protestant piety from apostolic times to the Reformation. So yeah, the author's credibility was challenged as soon as the book first appeared. A lot of folks accused Fox of dealing falsely with the evidence, misusing documents, and of telling partial truths. In every case that he could clarify, Fox corrected errors in the 2nd edition and the 3rd and the 4th. But by this point, Fox was considered a poor historian, in at least mainstream reference works. The 1911 Encyclopedia Britannica said this of Fox: "The gross blunders due to carelessness have often been exposed, and there is no doubt that Fox was only too ready to believe evil of the Catholics, and he cannot always be exonerated from the charge of willful falsification of evidence. It should, however, be remembered in his honor that his advocacy of religious toleration was far in advance of his day." Memoirs of a Woman of Pleasure, popularly known as Fanny Hill, is a naughty novel by the English novelist John Cleland, first published in London in 1748. Written while the author was in debtor's prison in London, it is considered the first original English prose smut, and the first smut to use the form of the novel. It is one of the most prosecuted and banned books in history. This book exemplifies the use of euphemism. The text has no swearing or explicit scientific terms for body parts, but it uses a lot of literary devices to describe genitalia. For example, the hoo-ha is sometimes referred to as the nethermouth, which is also an example of psychological displacement. A critical edition by Peter Saber includes a bibliography and a lot of notes that are kind of useful. The collection launching Fanny Hill contains several essays on the historical, social, and economic themes underlying the novel. Initially, there was actually no government reaction to it, but in November of 1749, a year after the first installment was published, the author and Ralph Griffiths were arrested and charged with corrupting the king's subjects. So the book eventually made its way to the US, and by 1821, a Massachusetts court outlawed it completely. The publisher, Peter Holmes, was convicted for printing a lewd and obscene novel. So, Holmes appealed to the Massachusetts Supreme Court. He claimed that the judge, relying only on the prosecution's description, hadn't even seen the book. The state Supreme Court was not swayed. The Chief Justice wrote that Holmes was a scandalous and evil-disposed person who had contrived to debauch and corrupt the citizens of Massachusetts, and to raise and create in their minds inordinate and lustful desires. In 1963, after the 1960 court decision in R vs. Penguin Books Limited that allowed the continuing publication of Lady Chatterley's Lover, Gareth Powell's Mayflower Books published an uncensored paperback version of Fanny Hill. The police became aware of the 1963 edition a couple days before publication, having spotted a sign in the window of the Magic Shop in Tottenham Court Road in London, run by Ralph Gold. Well, an officer went to the shop, bought a copy, and delivered it to a magistrate, Sir Robert Blundell, who issued a search warrant. At the same time, 2 officers from the Metropolitan Police's Obscene Publications branch visited Mayflower Books. Why? Well, they wanted to determine whether copies of the books were kept on the premises. They interviewed Powell, the publisher, and took away 5 copies. Just 5. Well, then the police returned to the Magic Shop and seized 171 copies of the book. And in December, Gold was summoned under Section 3 of the Obscene Publications Act. By then, Mayflower had distributed 82,000 copies of the book, but it was Gold who was being tried. But Mayflower did cover the legal costs. The trial took place in February of 1964, and the defense argued that Fanny Hill was a historical source book, and that it was a joyful celebration of normal, non-icky intercourse. You know, it was bawdy rather than sinful. Well, the prosecution countered by stressing one atypical scene involving flagellation, and they won. Written in Bastille during the French Revolution, The 120 Days of Sodom is a heck of a book. So the author was actually interrupted when the prison was stormed by insurgents and never finished the story. But it remains amongst the most notorious works of literature throughout history, featuring a lot of depraved stuff, red fluid-soaked naughty group parties, torment and under the age of consent, batty icky things, and a lot more that I can't say because the internet's a fun place. Described as very naughty, its plot revolves around the activities of 4 wealthy libertine men seeking out the ultimate way of gratifying themselves through group parties, sealing themselves away in an inaccessible castle in the heart of the Black Forest in Germany with 4 madams and a harem of 36 victims. The madams relate stories of their most memorable clients, whose crimes and punishments inspire the libertines to likewise and increasingly harm their victims to their eventual deaths. Now, this novel was actually never completed. Its first chapter was written according to Sade's written plan, but the subsequent chapters are in the form of rough drafts and notes, often consisting of graphic descriptions of the novel scenes. So this book was first published in Germany in 1904 and then banned across Europe for much of the 20th century. A 1975 film adaptation was also banned in several countries. South Korea has banned the book twice this century, and now it can only be sold there if you're like 19 or up. And finally for today, Mein Kampf is a book that should really only exist in a museum so that we don't turn into a case of those who ignore history are doomed to repeat it. This is an autobiography of Germany's infamous, actually Austrian-born dictator. Its title means My Struggle, because yeah, okie dokie dude. It's been described as like, hey everybody, give this man, a big round of applause for his perseverance, his sheer determination, because hard work makes dreams come true. The book, released in 2 volumes, is in reality the evil dictator's case for all the bad things he did. He outlines exactly how he came to be, well, who he was, before putting forth his views and describing his vision for the future of Germany. Interestingly enough, Germany actually held the copyright over it until 2016, and until then, printing and distributing this book was banned. But now that it's in the public domain, well, the ban's been lifted. There was actually a new edition released a little while back, but still, when you think about who wrote it, I'm not saying it should be completely erased from history, but maybe it should just be kept in a museum. Well, that's it for me once again, folks. I've been Alexa, your resident ookie spooky girly. See y'all next time, you lovely spooky people.